part of the reason that I love talking about Sedgwick's early work in epistemology of the closet is because unlike a lot of other queer scholars from that era, Sedgwick was reading feminist theory in the 1980s, so people like Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was quite conversant in the concept of intersectionality. And so this is a quote from Epistemology of the Closet. She says, it's important to recognize that not all oppressions are congruent, they are differently structured, and so much intersect in complex embodiments. So you see her using the word intersect there because she's thinking about how queerness intersects with disability, with race, with ethnicity, with gender, right? Such that we can't simply speak of all oppressions being the same, right? We need to bring these other identity factors into the equation when we are talking about how people are embodied and how they are relating to social norms. In her early work, she's very much invested in questioning why the hetero-homo binary structures our world and the way that that came to be. Like Foucault, she's looking at this moment in the late 19th century when these words began to become the structuring binary of our time. The word, by the way, many of you might know this, heterosexuality and homosexuality, those words don't even get invented until the 1870s, right? So the idea that like someone like is heterosexual or is homosexual, I mean, that's a very specific scientific medical category that comes in at that time. And it doesn't even, I say 1870s, but it doesn't even become like primary at that time, right? So through much of the 19th century and even in the early 20th century in the United States and many parts of Europe, someone who today we might say is gay or homosexual was actually thought of as being an invert, right? So an invert was the idea that, let's say we're talking about a gay man, that he was actually a woman trapped in a man's body, right? I told you earlier that I read these autobiographies from the 19th and early 20th century, and it's quite amazing actually, because you have these men who today we would very much recognize as being like cisgender men, but they know they desire men, and so they're being labeled inverts. And so in their autobiographies, you see them convincing themselves that they are women trapped in men's bodies. And it's often like it's not working at the level of the narrative. It's like they're not convincing you because they're not convincing themselves. But that's what they're being told. They're like, you're a woman trapped in a man's body. This last point on the slide is actually what I think is one of Sedgwick's most important insights, that she elaborates from Foucault, but I think elaborates it more explicitly and persuasively than Foucault does. And that is not just that we arrange ourselves in this hetero-homo binary, but she asks why it is that sexual orientation comes to mean the gender of our object choice. When I was younger and reading queer theory for the first time, this is probably the Sedgwickian insight that most like blew my mind. It doesn't have to blow anyone else's, but it blew my mind, right? Because what Sedgwick says is that she's like, okay, we tend to think that heterosexuality is radically different from homosexuality. And we also think that bisexuality is different, asexuality is different, but she says actually all of these categories have something in common. Every single one decides your sexuality, names your sexuality, marks your sexuality in terms of the gender of the person you are with, right? So if you're hetero, let's take a man as our example, a cis man. If you're hetero, that's because you want to have sex with women. So that defines the fact that you're hetero. If you're a gay man, you want to have sex with men. That's what makes you homo. If you're bisexual, you might want to have sex with men and women. That's what makes you bi. And if you're asexual, you don't want to have sex with men or women, and that's what makes you asexual. But in every single instance, your sexuality is being decided by the gender of the people that you are with. And Sedgwick asks, why do we organize sex that way? right? Why is that the way we think about our sexuality? Why don't we think about our sexuality in terms of what gives us pleasure, in terms of what we enjoy, in terms of what incites our bodies? And I say that she elaborates this from Foucault because this is exactly Foucault's concern about sexual identity. Foucault is okay with people saying they're gay or straight or whatever, but he's like, what matters is what you do with it, right? Like, how does it then become the occasion of producing pleasure for your body? So he talks somewhat mysteriously in some of his work about bodies and pleasures, and this is what he means. He's trying to imagine a world where your sexuality is defined around pleasure as opposed to being defined around this sense of who am I at my core? What secret lies deep within me to be discovered? Foucault's like, there is no secret there. If you think there's a secret there, it leads you on a mad search that ultimately kind of disciplines you. All there is a body for you to learn how to create pleasure on and in. And why isn't that what we mean by our sexuality? Couple of quick anecdotes. Well, not anecdotes. These aren't stories about me. Stories about, right. So the first is a kind of thought experiment, right? So let's say that you're a heterosexual woman, right? Is it the case that when you are having sex with a man, your thought sequence is like, this is so hot because I'm such a woman and he's such a man, and what he's doing to me right now is so manly, and the way that I'm reacting to it is so womanly, and oh my God, I'm so feminine right now, and he's so masculine right now, because, I mean, it's absurd at some level, and yet that's what's kind of implied by this idea of sexuality being defined by object choice. Not to mention that it hypergenitalizes sex, right? Because it's like, well, he has this thing, and I have this thing, and they go together in these ways, but like, how much of our sex and the enjoyment that we receive from it is otherwise than what society calls our genitals, right? What part involves our arms and our legs and our feet and our faces and our ears and our eyes? None of that counts for the way we talk about sexuality in the West. None of it, right? It's like, what is your sexual orientation? Gay, right? But I mean, there's a truth to it, but like what's lost is a lot of the subtlety and the complexity and the pleasure of sex, right? Another story that David Halperin, who's a queer theorist but a classicist as well, gives in one of his essays, is like a sex advice like column. In the US, there's this very popular gay sex podcast guy, Dan Savage, right? But this is not Dan Savage, this is a different one, but it's that kind of genre of like the sex advice columnist. And this guy writes in and he says, I'm having a crisis. My girlfriend bought me a massage for my birthday, and I went and had the massage, and it ended up being a man and not a woman. He thought it was going to be a woman giving him the massage, but it was a man, and he's like, that's okay, I was cool with that. But then at the end of it, the masseur gave him a blowjob, and he enjoyed it. So he writes into the sex columnist saying, am I gay? And this is exactly what Foucault worries about, that you take something that felt good and you refer it to a question of identity. You say, this thing happened and I enjoyed it. What does it mean about me? What truth, what hidden truth does it reveal about my soul, right? This is what Foucault worries about. And Foucault would say, why can't the answer simply be that the truth lies in the pleasure? The fact that it felt good, that's what's true. But no, that's not the way we think about sex. We're like, what does it reveal about who you are as a person? So like, the guy gave you a blowjob. It felt good. Okay. Why can't that be the end of story? Or maybe not the end. Maybe you want to go get another massage, right? But like, why can't that just be its own thing? Why does it have to get tied up in like, does that mean I have my sexuality all wrong, right? And you could imagine the story going the other way, where you had a gay man who had a woman giving him a massage and receives a blowjob and then says like, what does this make me? Am I actually straight? Am I bi? Do I need to like drop out of like my gay men's group that I'm in? You know, and this is the other thing about these labels and these identities and such becoming quite restrictive and kind of governing our behavior in ways that we don't realize. Next slide. Throughout her work, Sedgwick emphasizes multiplicity, ambiguity, and experimentation in matters of sexual practice and gender sexual identification. I highly encourage reading Sedgwick's work. There's an essay of hers that's quite wonderful called Queer and Now. I will make sure that the center has this essay in stock now that I'm thinking about it. But Sedgwick is very famous for these lists that she creates, right? So it's like these lists of possibilities, permutations, and so on that help us to see the ways in which like something that we think we know, like the category man or the category straight, actually is like really complicated and requires a lot of other things to be in place for it to make any sense. And so, Sedgwick is a literary scholar, as am I, and what Sedgwick loves about big, difficult novels, like she's a very avid reader, she was a very avid reader of Henry James. She loves novels that are complex and have really flowery, elaborate prose, precisely because she likes the way in which experimental prose kind of multiplies possibilities of meaning that for her are queer. So she has this is probably one of the most famous Sedgwick quotes. One of the things that queer can refer to, the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. Right? This is a very Sedgwickian sentence, and you can, if you've ever read Henry James, you can see his influence all over this prose, right? But the idea here is that for her, queer is naming when things don't line up, right? When things that are supposed to just present themselves as like perfectly, monolithically obvious don't, right? This emphasis on polysemic signification, and polysemic is just a fancy word that means like multiple meanings. This emphasis on polysemic signification allies queer theory to close reading, the kind of close reading that Sedgwick did of novels, and to creative interpretive practice. The task of the queer close reading is to find in aesthetic ambiguity the materiality of queer desire, identification, and intimacy. So the idea is that when you are reading a novel or a poem and you're digging for meaning, you're like seeing what other possibilities for meaning reside there, what other kinds of meanings are insinuated or implied, that you're engaged in a kind of queer reading practice because you're refusing to take the text at face value and you're insisting that there's more there than meets the eye, that things don't line up as perfectly as they might seem to. And finally, our last slide. Queer elaborations, which we can talk more in the Q&A. And this is just my way of kind of saying about where queer theory is now and where it's going now. I've presented to you tonight material by Sedgwick, by Butler, by Foucault, by Berlant, by Halprin, by Warner, but it needs to be said these are all white scholars, right? And queer theory has, I would argue, been most kind of driven in the last 10 to 20 years by queer of color critique, by people who were thinking about queerness at its intersections with race, with ethnicity, with disability as well. We could talk more about that. The idea here, and I'll say this as kind of pithily as I possibly can, is that this discipline in the 19th century that created a lot of these labels that we use today, like hetero and homo, right, was the very same system that was involved in eugenics, right? So when we talk about sexology, the study of sex that emerges out of the 19th century, many of the same people that were doing sexology were also eugenicists. In other words, they thought that you could create, or that you should try to create, a master race, right? By breeding out characteristics that you associated with people of color, people with disabilities, and so on, right? So sexology is a very compromised science, and in fact, in many regards, a pseudoscience, as eugenics was and continues to be. I wish I could say this is like dated, except if you read the news the other day out of the UK, Boris Johnson hired this advisor on board who is an avowed eugenicist, right? He believes that people of color have lower IQs than white people, and you should try to organize society to limit the reproductive capacities of people of color. And when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, was asked, do you subscribe to this idea about IQs? He didn't answer. He didn't officially repudiate this advisor who had espoused these views. So this stuff is still very much alive, right? But the reason I bring this up right now is because this idea of what a normal person is in terms of their gender presentation, in terms of their sexuality, is also highly racialized, right? So what it meant to be the right kind of woman, what it meant to be the right kind of straight citizen and so on, was also tied up with these questions of race and with ethnicity. So much so that you have scholars like Sylvia Wynter, like more recently a scholar like Keela Schuler, who ask these questions like, was the category woman in the 19th century ever inclusive of women of color, particularly black women in the United States? Were they ever thought of or seen as being women? Or were they always excluded from that category in such a way that it actually doesn't make sense to talk about a normal black woman? Because in some ways, black women were always rendered queer. Whether they were heterosexual, whether they were lesbian, whatever, they were always rendered queer by a normed gendered body that was predicated on white supremacy, right? This then also opens onto another, even sort of newer field of queer theory, right, like decolonial queer studies, that is coming at these questions about the racialization of gender and sexuality through the lens of colonialism. A lot of the important work on decolonial queer is coming out of Latin America, for example, where people are asking about the ways in which the normal body was also being defined over and against the body of the colonial others, who were then seen as being sexually abnormal, as having weird bodies, excessive bodies, profligate bodies, right? And decolonial queer studies is still relatively new, but one of the things that I think is really interesting about it is that it gets us thinking again about that question of hegemony, because it gets us thinking about questions of desire. So you hear more people now talking about decolonizing desire, right? Recognizing that the desires that we have, that we think are often authentic or just naturally ours, actually have this colonial history to them, where certain bodies were seen as being unattractive, unsexual, or too sexual, right? Such that we can't take our desires for granted. Another term that's getting more kind of traction, I suppose, these days from, let's say, people like Jasbir Puar, is this idea of queer assemblages. And I won't say too much about this, except to say that queer assemblage allows us to think about queerness as a kind of becoming. So if the insight of performativity is that we're always doing our gender, well then at some level what that means is that queerness can happen at any time. It might simply be about taking our body and putting it in a new situation, putting it in a different network, putting it in contact differently with elements of the world, that then it can become queer in conversation with, where it can form these sorts of moving assemblages that don't require us to think of our bodies as being queer in the beginning, or that don't require us to identify as gay, straight, or anything, but instead become queer through acts of connecting, reconnecting, and reassembling. This then goes on to the next, I would say, kind of like burgeoning area of queer studies, which is queer ecologies, that is attempting to think about the queerness of ourselves and our bodies in relationship with non-human entities. That might be non-human animals, right? Or it might mean bacteria, fungi. It might mean stones, water, but getting us to think about ourselves in a much more fundamentally ecological fashion. Because part of what queer theory tries to do is break down the naturalness of the word I. You say I, but it's like, who is that I? In what ways does the I's legibility, its coherence, its viability in the world depend upon it being gendered in a certain way, sexed in a certain way, racialized in a certain way. So queer theory asks, what gets hidden in that word I, that taken for granted I, that naturalized I? And one thing that gets hidden are the ecological networks on which the I fundamentally depends for its livelihood, right? Clean water, clean air, soil, all kinds of things. And to give one quick example, which I'll end on, right? Scientists are learning more and more how absolutely dependent we are on like the bacteria that live within us. I mean, we've known for a long time that like we need those bacteria, right? And we have many, 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 many different bacteria species. They populate us throughout our bodies, particularly in our gut, right? And we've always known we needed them. Well, not always, but recently. But now they're even finding, right, that your bacteria is tied to your mood, to questions of anxiety, to questions of depression, and to even elements of personality now, right? Such that when you're thinking about what your sexuality is, like I'm gay, to what degree are your bacteria gay? Or is your current bacterial composition in some way informing the desires that you're having, right? These are fundamentally ecological questions. So queer ecology, decolonial queer, queer of color critique, these are some exciting new kind of places that queer theory is going, also the intersection with disability studies. And so I end there, but we can also talk about those things or we can talk about other things. But thank you for listening.